Hey folks, back once again from in-house quarantine. It's your number one Google Slides live stream, uh, bringing you only the hottest of slides in the Santa Cruz County area. Um, Now, a question that I get from viewers all the time is people see these words, these symbols that have a phonetic realization on my slideshow, and they're like, "That's amazing that you can capture sound with images like you do. Where did you get that idea?" And here's the story that I always tell people. I mean, I've told this story a lot in my DMs. I might as well just tell it here publicly. And it's a story from a book called Très Tropique by a dude named Claude Lévi-Strauss. And it's a story about a writing lesson. And the story is this. Claude Lévi-Strauss is an anthropologist. He worked in the Amazon in the early part of the 20th century. And of course, anthropologists always go about with their little field notebook, taking notes. While they take notes, they often kind of give people orders, order them around, ask people for information. So Claude Lévi-Strauss is doing this in the rainforest with a group that had been contacted before by Western civilization, but wasn't yet under the power of the Brazilian government. So it's still an independent tribal group called the Nembiquara. And the chief of the Nembiquara, well, there wasn't a chief of the Nembiquara yet, but there became a chief of the Nembiquara very briefly when one member of the band observed what Lévi-Strauss was doing and started doing the same thing. Writing stuff down, actually just making kind of wavy squiggles, speaking as though he were reading what he had written and using that writing to command people, to boss them around. So the moral of the story that Lévi-Strauss draws is that writing is basically just primarily a tool for oppression, a tool for enslavement. He says, well, all the big empires that have ever existed have depended on writing to boss people about, to get people to do what they want. That's a pretty grim story about writing, but there is one counterexample, apparent counterexample, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, and that is a script called Tifinagh. It is a script that's used in the Sahara by lots of different groups of Berbers. The ones that have kept the tradition up the longest, probably unbroken since antiquity, are the Tuareg of the southern Sahara. Now, Tifinagh is a writing system. It represents various Berber languages that are recorded in it, but it is not used to boss people about. It is used, well, for graffiti. It's used for graffiti and such things as that. It's used for riddles, and it's used for word games. It's a script that exists, it seems like entirely for recreational activities. And it exists in a society that has lots of structures to prevent anyone from getting like serious individual power in the way that one does in a state. So it seems like, hey, here's a script that shows that at least Lévi-Strauss is not always right. It is possible to have scripts that are for fun, that don't involve enslaving other people. Now, I say that Tifinagh is used primarily by the Tuareg, but that's in a kind of restricted sense, because Tifinagh has been sort of adopted more broadly by various Berber ethnic national movements across North Africa. So in a number of North African countries, it's a script that gets used side by side with the Arabic script. It's a way for Berbers to assert that, yes, we have a literate culture, yes, we need to be taken seriously as citizens of the nature, of the nation. So you see it on things like road signs, you see newspapers, novels written in this Tifinagh alphabet. The form of Tifinagh that's used in Algeria, for instance, or Morocco, is a fairly modern invention that uses a lot of symbols from the older Tifinagh script, but is not identical with it. So it's called Neo-Tifinagh by people who are kind of specialists in the field. Moving in the other direction, though, we get to an interesting place as well. We get to a script called Libico-Berber, which looks a lot like Tifinagh, and that's because, again, it uses a lot of the same Tifinagh symbols, but it's much older. So the transition from Libico-Berber script to Tifinagh is usually placed somewhere around 500 CE, roughly. Nobody really knows, but it's somewhere in that first millennium. And this older script, which has not totally been deciphered yet, we know roughly how it works phonetically because it shares a lot of symbols in common with modern Tifinagh, and because it occurs in a lot of bilingual inscriptions with languages that we do know. More on that in a minute. Clearly seems to be used on the basis of certain phonetic features, the way it pluralizes words, for instance, to write some kind of a Berber language, but it's not a Berber language that's exactly like any of the modern ones. Some people say it's a sister phylum, it's not that closely related. Others say it's just, well, a Berber language that doesn't have as much influence from, for instance, Arabic as all the ones that are currently spoken do have. So this is a form of script, the Libico-Berber Tifinagh, which exists in classical antiquity. It dates back to sometime in the first millennium. Again, nobody's exactly sure when, but there are a lot of good guesses, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, too. Now, there is this possibly even older script, which is even less understood. I skipped a slide there with an example of a bilingual inscription. The Libico-Berber Tifinagh is on the right. On the left is Punic script, which we can read just fine. Now, there is this older, archaic Libico-Berber, which works in yet a different way, which we understand even less well. And I'm not really going to be talking about that. That's also a first millennium BC script, probably. So the Libico-Berber script is actually in really widespread use in antiquity, all throughout the Maghreb, throughout North Africa, from about Tunisia west. There are rock inscriptions just all over the place. See those little dots there? Places where there's a lot of rock in the Sahara, so the inscriptions stick around. The topmost diagram shows epigraphic inscriptions on things like gravestones in the sort of town-dwelling areas of North Africa, where the Tifinagh is also used. There are even, although they're not indicated on this map, Tifinagh inscriptions, rock art in the Canary Islands, showing that the Canary Islands had been settled first by Berbers coming over from North Africa long before the Spanish got there. So Libico-Berber script is a script that corresponds to a kind of culture, a culture speaking Berber-like languages, a culture with some continuities with Saharan cultures existing now. It doesn't really belong to a political unit in the same way that, for instance, Latin does during the same period. Latin is a script with which Tifinagh is in competition in a lot of areas of North Africa. But there are certain kind of discrete centers of use. Towns that are historically part of an area known as Numidia, and towns that are just to the west of Carthage. So towns on the eastern edge of Numidia, this historical region, which is near Carthage, have the highest, apparently, incidence of Tifinagh epigraphy. Tifinagh on gravestones and public monuments and things of that nature. The use of Tifinagh is always there throughout Roman rule in North Africa. In late antiquity, it even becomes a little bit more prominent as Latin loses some of its dominance and as Punic languages sort of fade away. Punic being the language of the Carthaginian Empire, which leaves really deep traces in North Africa. It's still spoken there in the 5th century, although Berber is much more common at that point. There are still Punic-speaking villages in North Africa in the 5th century CE. And this concentration of epigraphic monuments, of inscriptions in Tifinagh, um, tells us something about where the script came from. Now, this is a contentious issue. There are a lot of theories about where the script came from. Some people say, well, it's just an indigenous invention on the basis of pre-existing geometrical characters that you see in rock art sometimes. And these people tend to say that the script is really old. But there's a lot of problems with the dating that they use, and on a more kind of conservative dating system, you can't really identify Tifinagh-like geometric elements in the rock art that predate the Tifinagh script. A more serious objection is that you really wouldn't invent this script to represent a Berber language if that was what you were trying to do. The Tifinagh script, as it was used in antiquity, the Libico-Berber script, has a really minimal vowel inventory. It only marks one vowel. Berber has 3, and those vowels are a lot more important in Berber than the corresponding vowels would be in a Semitic language like Punic. So people think probably this language was imported from Punic at some point. There are good reasons to think that, for instance, that a number of symbols, for instance, the letter T, are identical between the two scripts, so there does seem to be at least some borrowing. Another reason to think that is that the word Tifinagh just means the Punic stuff. In Berber languages, adding t as a prefix is a way of making a noun out of an adjective, so or marking something as a noun, so you've got something like Tifunest means a cow, funest is the root, tamart is a beard, like on your face, mart is the root, or mar is the root, actually, the t is a suffix and a prefix there. So likewise, Tifinagh means the Finagh stuff, the Punic stuff. So etymologically, there's a reason to think that this alphabet comes from some kind of Punic or Phoenician script. And then there's some debate about that. There's a theory that it was developed around the Straits of Gibraltar in the far west of the Maghreb, which seems to offer an explanation for the extent of its spread to the west, all the way to the Canary Islands, but doesn't really respect the fact that most inscriptions are much further east. And doesn't respect the fact that the Tifinagh alphabet has one vowel exactly like the Punic alphabet, the one used in Carthage. So the right answer is probably that the Tifinagh script was developed near Carthage and in contact with Punic colonists sometime in, say, the 3rd, 2nd century BCE. But again, there's a lot of debate around this, and the issue is not exactly settled. People who do go with the last option and place its origins, again, in that region of Numidia, this kind of ancient Berber state that allies with Rome in the Second Punic War and helps beat Carthage in the end, and becomes an ally of the Roman Empire, before eventually, as all allies of the Roman Empire are, getting taken over by the Roman Empire. So the eastern fringe of that area is where Tifinagh inscriptions on monuments are most common. So that's where people sort of locate the creation of the script. Some people say, well, it's probably in this town called Thuga or Duga, which is on the map that I showed you before. But in any case, people then kind of associate the script, the invention of the script, with the establishment of the Numidian state in the wake of the Second Punic War, at a period in time when it looks like Numidia is going to be the big power in North Africa. Numidia is going to replace the Punic Empire. It's a power that's more favorably related to Rome, but still independent. And so people say with some plausibility that the Tifinagh script is developed or at least popularized as part of the state-making apparatus of this Numidian state proto-empire that gets going and then kind of runs up against a big obstacle when Rome decides it's going to intervene in its royal succession over the course of a very long conflict called the Jugurthine Wars, which is important for late Roman Republican history too, but important in our context because it basically marks the beginning of the end of Numidia's independence. The Tifinagh script, then, is sort of a trace, a relic of that aborted independence, that partial state formation. So does it confirm Claude Lévi-Strauss's hypothesis or not? It's hard to say, because here you see a case where a script comes into being to assist a state, but does not necessarily produce an oppressive state. So the Tifinagh script can sort of persist in this playful way without necessarily leading to the development of oppressive state apparatuses later on. The moral of the story, I suppose, is that the origin of something like the Tifinagh script doesn't necessarily dictate its future trajectories. The fact that it comes about, if indeed it does, again, this is somewhat contentious, as part of a state-making project, doesn't necessarily mean that this script is always going to lead to the formation of states. There are ways to have writing, but resist state formation, even if you've gone a little bit down that road already. Well, everyone, I hope you're staying indoors and staying healthy, and I will catch you again next week. Same time, same place.